Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about proteins. Proteins are one of the 4 important organic biological molecules that we find in the human body, along with lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. So like the other organic biological molecules, proteins have a carbon skeleton that forms the basis of them. But this carbon skeleton has lots of things attached to it in a protein, such as amino groups and carboxyl groups. Like the nucleic acids and the carbohydrates, proteins have a monomer and a polymer. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid, and the polymer, which is multiple amino acids connected to each other, is often just referred to as a protein, but it can also be called a peptide or a polypeptide. In terms of functions, proteins do a lot of different things in our cells. Basically, they perform all of the functions of a cell that weren't being performed by the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids. Right? So they're going to do lots of things. They're highly involved with transport and movement. They can be involved with signaling. They're going to be involved with speeding up chemical reactions. Again, like I said, many different functions here. Examples of proteins you might be familiar with include hemoglobin, which is the protein that's inside of your red blood cells and carries oxygen. Another example are antibodies. Antibodies are defensive proteins found in our body fluids that help us to fight off infection. And maybe you've heard of insulin. Insulin is a hormone, but it's made from a protein, and this is a hormone that's really important for regulating our blood sugar levels. In terms of nutrient sources, proteins come from mostly meat in our diet, but there are some vegetable sources that are high in protein, such as beans and nuts. Now let's take a closer look at protein structure. As I mentioned before, proteins have a monomer and a polymer. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid, and the polymer is called a protein or a peptide or a polypeptide. So let's take a closer look at this amino acid, because basically what we do to make a protein is we take multiple amino acids and string them together to form the protein. It turns out there are 20 different varieties of amino acids that are used in the human body. And these 20 different amino acids get grouped into multiple ways to form more than 30,000 different proteins in our bodies. So at the top of the screen here, we see some examples of amino acids. So we have 20 amino acids that we use in the body, but I only showed 6 for simplicity's sake. So amino acids are the monomer, or the basic unit to a protein. In order to form a protein, what we have to do is connect multiple amino acids together. And then the final product that we have at the end is called a protein. So let's take a look at that amino acid structure in more detail. So there are 20 different amino acids, but they all have the same basic structure to them. Right? So they all have common parts. They all have a central carbon atom. Right? So this is a carbon-based molecule, so it has a central carbon atom. And then attached to that carbon atom, we're going to find 4 things. An amino group, which is a nitrogen with hydrogens, and that's where the name amino comes from, an amino acid. Also attached to the central carbon is a carboxyl group. Right? Carboxyl groups are acidic, so that's where the acid part of amino acid comes from. Also attached to the central carbon is a hydrogen, and then last but not least is something called a variable group, or an R group, or a side chain. This variable group is what it sounds like. It varies from amino acid to amino acid. So I mentioned there are 20 different amino acids. The only thing that's different about these 20 different amino acids is the R group. The R groups come in a lot of different varieties. Some of them are just a hydrogen, some of them are just a methyl group, some of them are larger ring structures, some of them are nonpolar. They come in a wide variety. Despite the R groups, if you look at the basis to an amino acid, you'll notice that there are many polar bonds here. So amino acids overall are polar in nature, making them very hydrophilic. So the polymer of a protein is simply called a protein, or as I said before, you can call this a peptide. And it's just a bunch of amino acids connected one to another. Once the amino acid chain has been assembled, there's some very complex folding that occurs to get the protein into its final structure. And the final structure of the protein is really important because, as we know in biology, structure lends to function. And if the structure of the protein is not correct, then it won't function properly. So in order to make sure that the protein structure is appropriate, we have to first make sure that we put the amino acids in the right order. And then secondly, we have to make sure that we folded the protein properly. Sometimes proteins can become unfolded. This process is called denaturation. So denaturation is a loss in shape, and if you lose shape, you lose function. And denaturation isn't exclusive to proteins. Other macromolecules like DNA can experience denaturation. Denaturation is often caused by changes in temperature and pH. In terms of functions, I mentioned before that proteins have a lot of different functions. Basically, they perform all of the cell's functions except for those that are performed by the nucleic acids, the carbohydrates, and the lipids. So what don't proteins do? Well, they don't carry the code for making themselves because DNA, a nucleic acid, carries the code for making proteins. They don't serve as the energy currency of cells. So proteins themselves can be used for energy, but not directly. Like carbohydrates and lipids, they can act as a form of energy, but that energy has to be converted into ATP, a nucleic acid, which then serves as the energy currency of cells. And while proteins can be used for energy, they're definitely not the preferred energy source. Our bodies don't like to use protein for energy, and they only do so if we're kind of running out of carbs and lipids. So what do proteins do? Well, they provide the main structure to our cells. They're important for moving cells around in the body and moving stuff around inside of cells. They're important for transporting substances into and out of cells. They're actually really great buffers. Buffers are molecules that can take in or release hydrogen ions as necessary in order to maintain a pH. Proteins are also involved with communication and defense. And proteins do something called catalysis. Catalysis is speeding up chemical reactions, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about enzymes.